Okay, so in this lecture, we will learn how to create a wage calculator. This allows us to learn how to do some calculations, how to get some input from the user, and how to store information. We're going to build an application where we're going to ask the user to enter the numbers of hours they've worked, as well as the pay rate or how much they get paid per hour. In Texas, as an example, minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. If the user worked 2 hours, we would simply multiply $7.25 by 2. This would give us the wage paid for the user. So to start off, I'm going to go back home and create a brand new project. Now, if you're not using Repellent.com, of course, you can use any other software that's useful for you to create C++ programs. I am using this one just to try to make it as easy as possible for some of you that might have issues connecting to our servers or installing some of those IDEs for yourself. So this is the easiest I can make it. That way you guys can get up and running as soon as possible. So from the home page, I'm going to click the plus button on the top right corner. I'm going to choose C++ as the language. And I'm going to call this one the wage calculator. I'm going to create the REPL. All right, so to start off, we're going to erase everything that's already included here. That way we can get used to memorizing what we need to memorize. And that way, if you're not using this website and using another IDE, maybe even as simple as Notepad++, which doesn't include anything, you at least know what you need to include here. So the first things we're going to include here is include IO stream. Alright, so the reason why we want to include iOS stream is to let the compiler know that we're going to end up using cin, cout, and some of the other related functionality that without iOS stream you wouldn't be able to input or output any data. The second line we'll include here is using namespace standard. So I'll press enter, type in using, and then namespace, std, and we have to finish with the semicolon. That's essential for programming. So I'm going to leave a little space here. Okay, so the next thing we'll be typing is int main. I'll press enter, open the curly brace. Press enter one more time to leave space between the curly braces. Within the curly braces, inside both opening and curly braces, we are going to type in return 0. And again, we're finishing with the semicolon. So return 0 in the main function means that the program executed successfully. If the program returns a 1 or a non-zero number, this tells us that we have a failure. Now I'm going to press enter here to leave a little space above return 0, since that has to be our last line of code within our main function. I'll press enter one more time just to be safe. And now we're going to write some comments to let ourselves and others know exactly what this program is going to be doing. So in this comment, I'm going to write down a basic description of what the program will be doing for us. So we'll be creating a program that will calculate our wage. So I'll press enter twice just to leave a little room. So now how do we start? Well, we have to plan out the steps. We can use comments to plan what we will need before programming. So for this case, we want to calculate the user's wage. We need to ask the user the number of hours they have worked and the pay rate or how much they make per hour. And with this, we can complete the calculation, which would be hours times pay or hours times the pay rate. After completing the calculation, we can display the answer for the user to see on the screen. So the first thing we need to do is to allocate some computer memory and RAM to store the hours, the pay rate, and the wage. So again, we want to use comments to break down the program. And that way we can come back and know exactly where we're at and what step we're in to building this program. And that way we don't get lost. So we're going to allocate some of the computer memory and RAM. And we'll be doing this by using variables. The next thing we're going to do is ask the user to enter the hours. So ask users to enter hours. We also have to store the hours. So once we ask the user for how many hours they worked, and once we store those hours, we also want to ask the user the pay rate. So how much they're getting paid an hour. After we ask them, of course, the user is going to type it in. So the next step would be to store the pay rate. After this, we want to calculate the wage, which is hours times pay rate. So calculate the wage, which is hours times pay rate. And of course, once we do the calculation, we need to store that value into a variable. That way we can reuse it. So we need to store the wage. Now lastly, of course, we have the wage stored into a variable, but we need to display it to the user. And that way the user knows the actual answer and it's not just stored within the program itself. So lastly, we want to display the wage to the user. And then we just end the program after that. All we just did here is called pseudocode. These steps break down the project into an algorithm and is plain English where most of us can understand in order to solve the problem. Now the program is just a solution to a sort of problem, and we're writing an application to solve those problems. So let's get started with the first step. We're going to start with creating a variable. So a variable is going to look at the computer's RAM or the computer's memory, and it's going to set aside a number of bytes depending on the type of data that we need to store. So let's start with the first step, which is this one right here. So a variable is going to look at the computer's RAM or computer's memory, and it's going to set aside a number of bytes depending on the type of data that we need to store. Variables have different data types. The main ones that we're going to be using here in the class are int, float, or double, char, string, and bool. So you can even make notes on this just so we can keep it within the program. And I guess I'll just put it on the very top just to make it our own little notes. Again, when you're doing comments, it does not affect the program whatsoever. You can do as many comments as you want, and it's all for your own benefit. And variables have different data types. This includes int, float, or double, char, string, and bool. So ints can store whole numbers, floats or doubles can store decimal values, a char can store only a single character at a time, a string can store a set of characters, making it words or just a set of characters, random characters if you wanted to. But if you're going to store more than a single character, you're going to use a string. And the last one would be the Boolean, and that can only store either true or false. That's it. So it only checks for that condition. Is it true or is it false? Now the first variable that we're going to store is hours. So which data type are we going to use for hours? Now being that hours is a number, that eliminates some of the options, as the hours we will be storing will not be whole numbers because one can work 8.5 hours. We'll be using double as data type. So I'm going to go down to my first step, which is allocate some memory in RAM to store the hours, pay rate, and wage. And I'm going to declare my first variable. So again, we're going to use double, and we're going to call the variable hours. Again, in order to close the line of code, we need to close it with a semicolon. Now we also want to store pay rate. This is for sure a double since we have a decimal point. As Texas right now, for example, the minimum wage is $7.25. So double, and we're going to call this variable pay rate. Again, we close it with a semicolon, and I'll press enter one more time. Now, the next variable we'll be needing is the wage variable to store our wage in there. And for this one, again, we will be using double. So double, oh, misspelled it. Double and wage. Close it with a semicolon. Looking back at the pseudocode that we wrote, these will be the only variables that we will be using. Now, looking at this program, as we broke it down into steps, we notice that we already have an input from the user. We have storage as we're storing the data. We have a process, which for us would be calculating the hours times pay rate. And we have an output as we will be displaying the results to the user. Now, if we have these 4 items, we know we are in the correct direction. If you're missing something, go back and make sure that you have everything you need, as it might lead to a logical error later on. Now, a logical error means that you forgot something to solve the problem, and not that you necessarily mistyped something or forgot a semicolon. The program might still run, but there's a logical error in there that you're gonna have to go find. So now that we have the variables declared, we go to step 2. So step 2 says we ask the user to enter the hours, and to do this, we are gonna use a cout statement. So I'm gonna go down to step 2, and I'm gonna type in cout. And in quotations, I'm gonna type in enter hours. I'll leave a little space so that way my text on the screen, and when the user types in the hours, there's a little space between both of them. So I'm gonna leave a little space and then close the double quotation and end it with a semicolon. So that's my step 1. So the next step is to store the user's input into a variable. Now, cout is to write out to the console, which is what you guys see over here. Cin is to take information that the user typed into the console and bring it into a variable that you can store. So we already have our cout, which we told the user to enter the hours. Now we need to store those hours. So down here, I'm going to type in cin, and now give it the variable name hours, and close it with the semicolon. Make sure you don't forget the semicolons. Now, why are we not using double quotations for the variable hours? Well, double quotations is only to display text on the screen. And since we're going to bring in data, we want to save it to our variable. Variables never use double quotations. Now, notice that the stream operator is in the opposite direction. Make sure you don't have it the same way as the cout. So we already asked the users for hours, and we already imported the hours to our variable. Now, we're not done yet. We need the pay rate. So we're going to ask the user for the pay rate. So cout. And in quotations, since we are displaying to the console, we're going to type in enter pay rate. Again, I'm leaving a little space, and don't forget the semicolon. Now, to store the pay rate, I'm going to do a cin, and I'll use my pay rate variable and close it with the semicolon. Now we've asked for the hours and we've asked for the pay rate. The next step is to store the wage. We'll have to start by doing our calculations between our variables, hour and pay rate. Now that we've typed the calculation, you notice there's a squiggly line underneath. Now this alone does the calculation, but we haven't stored it anywhere. We need to store the value into a variable. In order to do this, we need to declare the variable before the formula. So I'm going to go to the very front of this line. I'm going to type in wage, since that's the variable we created to store this data in. Space equals, and then our calculation goes after. So what this does is we're getting the value of these and putting it into wage. So this actually goes up here, since we did both the calculation and we stored it in one line of code. So we're almost done. Our next step is to display the wage variable. So we already have it saved. Now we need to display it. So we can do this by doing a cout. So I'm gonna go down here, leave a little room. I'm gonna type in cout. the wage variable, and we're going to end the line. Now we're using aligned to make sure that this line of code executes and it moves the cursor one line down. Now this could be similar to you pressing enter after you type the sentence in a Word document. It basically starts a brand new line. Now we can run it and see what it displays. Let's run the program. Now we can see that our first cout statement is already being displayed on screen. It says enter hours. So I'm going to type in 40 hours. I'm going to press enter. It says enter pay rate. I can say I got paid $7 an hour. You know what? $7.50. Press enter. And it tells me that 300 would be my wage. Now we can see that it returns a value, but it's just a number alone. Now to make this a bit nicer, let's add a description or some text before the wage value to make this easier to read. So we're going to use what is called a string literal. So I'm going to go down to where we're displaying the wage to the user, and right before the wage variable, I'm going to type in quotations, double quotations, wage space equals, and we can even add a $sign. I'm going to put a little space afterwards and close the quotation. Now if we leave it as is, this will not work. You need to add the insertion operator again. So add them again, and voila, the errors are gone. Now you can run the program again to see the results. So enter hours, type in 40. Pay rate, I had put $7.50. You guys can put whatever numbers you want. And now we have a nicer way of displaying this. So now we have wage equals a $sign and then the 300. Now lastly, make sure you still have return 0 at the end of the program. Make sure you didn't delete it by accident. This program is still a little simple, and we can make it a little nicer by adding a title bar at the top. Now you guys can get creative and add more stuff to this, but that's what I'll be doing. So on the very top, before we even ask the first question, I'm gonna make some room, and I'm gonna type in cout. And for this one, I'll just put a bunch of little stars. Again, we'll close it with semicolon. And I'm just going to copy this because I'm going to have it on top and the bottom. And in between, I can type wage calculator. I went a little too far. Let me just return that a bit, so I can try centering it. And there you go. That might look a little better. I don't think it's perfectly centered. Let's try it out. Oh, so what did I do wrong? I did not put end line. Let's try it one more time. And there you go. It looks a little nicer. Now you can get creative. Mine's on a little centered, so I can even try fixing that. Let me see. I don't even think I have the even number of stars. And there you go. Kind of fixed. So you can do this and add more little things here and there to make it a little nicer and be more creative. But something like this is good enough. You're able to get the calculation up and going, so I can run it again. I can maybe work 80 hours, which is a crazy amount. I wish I would get paid maybe $60 an hour, and I could easily be making $4,800. And that's it. If you have any questions on this program or the previous one, feel free to send me a message using Blackboard or Pronto, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you. Have a great day.